Good evening, everyone. I think I should start by introducing myself. I'm Jocelyn Che, and I'm an honorary professor in the School of Languages and Cultures of this university. And I'd like to welcome you all this evening on behalf of the school and the university. And as is the custom, I would also like to acknowledge that we're meeting tonight on the unceded land of the traditional owners, who are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and honor their elders, past, present, and emerging. So tonight's program, I'd just like to make it clear, we're meeting at the university and we're supported by this university's School of Languages and Cultures, also by the Institute for Asian and Australian Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University, and the New South Wales branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. And there are representatives of those two last bodies, both here tonight, and you're going to hear from them in due course. I also like at the outset to acknowledge the help and support of the Chau Chak Wing Museum, and personally to thank the acting director, Craig Barker, for helping us to mount this event. And I'm also greatly indebted to Daniel Bolger of Australian Innovation Media, who is video recording the event so that it will be available to other people who've not been able to get here tonight online. So thank you to Craig and to Dan. And that reminds me also to ask you very kindly to put your phones on silent or turn them off, because we are being recorded. Before I hand over to our Master of Ceremonies, I'd just like to say a little bit more about my own background. So I was an undergraduate here at the University of Sydney. In fact, I was in the very first class teaching any Asian language anywhere in Australia. So quite a long time ago, but the University of Sydney has been a pioneer in the study and research of not only Indigenous cultures and languages, but also foreign languages and cultures. And I was thinking about this in preparing to what to say tonight, and I remembered that after about 1 year of study of Chinese language and history, somebody asked me what it was like. And I said, I can't really tell you, because it's not so much just learning a language, but it's a whole new perspective on the world. It's a whole new culture, something which I had never come across at school or anywhere else. So it was like a window into a complete new world. And that, I think, is the virtue and the strength of the study of foreign language, any foreign language and culture, particularly if one comes to it as an impressionable undergraduate. But sadly, since then, we've seen a trend against the teaching of foreign languages. Numbers generally are declining in schools, and support for arts degrees is not notably coming from our government either, although perhaps we might hear something in the budget papers tonight. I doubt it. It seems that people more focus on the problems of foreigners and foreign languages than on the benefits. And that's leading to social dissension and misunderstanding, with sometimes dreadful results, as we have seen even in Sydney today. So this panel is meeting at a very opportune time, and that's what our panelists are going to discuss. And so it's my pleasure to hand over to our very capable MC for the evening, Dr. Helen Vatsikopoulos, who has herself written and spoken on multicultural issues in her several decades of work with, particularly with the ABC and SBS, and she's going to take charge of the discussion. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. And thank you to Sydney University and the Dr. Chau Chak Wing Museum for hosting this. Our panellists today, Andrew Jakubowicz is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Technology, Sydney. Andrew's been involved in multicultural affairs for many years at the national and local level. His writing on multiculturalism, racism and social resilience is regularly published, and he's also the lead author in the 2025 book, The Elgar Companion to the Arts and Global Multiculturalism. Jing Han is Director of the Institute for Australian and Asian Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University, where she's also Professor of Translation Studies. She's translated several well-known Australian novels into Chinese, and previously she was Head of Subtitling at SBS. Jackie Menzies is the President of the Asian Arts Society of Australia and an Honorary Associate of the School of Languages and Cultures at the University of Sydney, and for many years, for 3 decades, she was in charge of Asian art and culture at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, where she negotiated many important international exhibitions. So here we are today. We're surrounded by beautiful art here at the Dr. Chau Chak Wing Museum at Sydney University. And we're here to discuss the state of our beautiful mosaic. This beautiful mosaic is Australia's multiculturalism. But of course, this beautiful mosaic is being threatened, confronted by some very ugly forces indeed. The ugly forces of racism, of scapegoating, and tensions that emanate from the other side of the world that are really putting pressures on this mosaic. So I want to start with some responses, maybe even gut reaction or your feelings about this beautiful mosaic and the ugly forces that confront it. Jackie, I want to start with you. How do you feel about the ugliness that is tearing it apart?
I feel more about the positive thing, about the beautiful mosaic. I think over the years I've been working, I've seen so very much the positive side of what we've learned and what everyone, as the whole community, has got from multiculturalism and diversity. And I really think that is there's many resilient networks that have been established, and I think that can counter any opposition at the moment, and I think our mosaic will continue to grow and strengthen. I'm afraid that's what I think. And in fact, I see the networks growing. I see the diversity growing. It's extending. You see artists who were bicultural now. You see they're tricultural now. They're global, transnational. So all this is actually very exciting in opening up all sorts of things, which I like to think will overcome any negative forces.
Well, that's wonderfully optimistic, and we will unpack some of the, through your experience, how this resilience shows itself in the museums and through artists' work. That's terrific. Jing Han, tell me, how do you feel about the ugly forces?
I think it's quite upsetting, which we can see, very right now, One Nation has gone so big, and One Nation, as we know, strongly against migrants, always blame migrants, and quite extreme right-wing. So that's really disturbing in many ways, and not only Pauline Hanson, but look at the Trump. So it's worse than anyone, and talking about Western democracy is very much threatened. Not only our mosaic, but really the democracy itself. It's so strongly undermined by people like Trump. But I also share Jackie's optimism. I myself came as an international student I was the opposite of Jocelyn. I was the first one at Sydney University, first China-born PhD in English literature. So I was opposite, studying the other way, but we share the same thing, is about the language, culture opened up another world. And I went on to do the continuing doing education, and I worked at SBS. I just think younger generation are very different. I'm very confident about the younger generation. I have 2 children who were born and grew up here. They are much more sophisticated, confident, open-minded than older generation, to say. And just look at the newly released data from Australian Bureau of Statistics, the top 10 largest population of migrants to this country: Indian, England, China, New Zealand, Philippines, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and South Africa and Malaysia. Most of them are actually from Asian countries. So the next generation, or the forthcoming generation, will change a lot of things. And then when children, especially when they grow up, because when I was at SBS, and at one time I was having a meeting, and then happened to be young people, and I looked around, to my surprise, visually, no 2 people look the same. So, you know, and in that sense, I'm quite optimistic.
Andrew. So, Andrew, together with some civil society activists, you've been involved in drafting some statements and very important messages. And in one particular one, you all wrote that Australia has arrived at a consequential moment. That is a very big statement. Tell us, what is this consequential moment we're facing?
Well, maybe I can put it in context with 2 other consequential moments. There's not only one, we get 3 of them. The first was really the beginning of the multicultural period, 1966. Robert Menzies retired, and the political class started to ask questions about where Australia would be in the future. And they began shifting some of the gears and levers around white Australia and a few other things to try and recognise that they were an immigrant country on the edge of Asia in a changing world where the old empires were disappearing fast and new nations were appearing everywhere. And that gave a kick-off, really. That was a very consequential moment, because that gave a kick-off to the invention, if you like, of the multicultural generation. And that rose and spread and grew through the 70s and 80s and 90s. And then in the middle of the 90s, 30 years on, there was a huge hiccup, and the second consequential moment happened. The Australian population, on balance, decided that they would prefer a future that wasn't quite so colourful, if I can use that term. And they elected a government which then set about trying to close down much of what had been achieved in the first generation. And that was 30 years ago. So we're now, in a sense, at the end of that cycle, right, 30 years on, and we're now at the third consequential moment, which is we have to make that choice again, right? We have to decide what sort of future we want. And we're doing it, I would say, without any of the sorts of leadership from the political class that the first 2 consequential moments had, right? Even if I didn't like what happened at the end of the first generation with the appearance of the Howard government and its closing down of things, there was clear leadership there, right? I think what we now have is a sort of mixed morass of people who really have no idea of what direction they want to move in, and really not much, if I put it, not much vision of wherever that might be, how we might get there. And I think that's why we're at a very dangerous, extremely dangerous moment. Now, I share with my colleagues a sense that new generations of people, particularly ones who have come from the more recent immigrant communities, have a much more complex and creative vision of what the future might be and their role in it. But the forces which so beautifully emerged in Farah on the weekend really are an indication of where the problems now lie, right? I mean, in a sense, when multiculturalism appeared as a social movement, there was an equal and opposite reaction against it. And that's been there all the time, right? We talk about multiculturalism being beautiful, but there are a lot of people who see it as a horror. And that dynamic, that tension has been worked out and worked through. And as the pressures of life and the world intensify, people tend to head for what they think is a comfortable simplicity, but we don't live in a comfortably simplistic society anymore. So that's why I think we're at a very, very important moment of choosing which direction we want to go in.
So are you saying that this present government, with its huge majority, and a multiculturalism minister, Anne Ali, family comes from the Middle East, don't know what to do at the moment? Are you saying that there's a lack of vision there? There is a lack of will to do something lest it backfires?
I think there's two dynamics there. One is the immediacy of the economic issues is really taking people's attention quite clearly. But I think there's also a sense that they don't know how. I mean, my insight, such as it is that at the government level, they really don't know what to do, right? They don't know whether to press ahead with, for instance, the recommendations of the Multicultural Framework Review that came out a couple of years ago, which have been totally accepted in principle and almost not implemented in practice. So I think that's the sort of place that we're at, that there is a sort of rhetoric and there is a reality. And the problem that we face is trying to understand what that reality actually looks like and how it might be refashioned. But I don't think there's any doubt that, to put it in the words of one government insider, there is no appetite in government for addressing the issues associated with multiculturalism. And they would prefer that it all went away. And the question, I think, for many of us is that given what happened at Farah and the huge rise in support for One Nation, we may well be seeing the emergence of, or not the emergence, the sort of concretisation, if you like, of that social movement that has always resisted the multicultural project in Australia. And that will just be one of their things, but that's one of the things that's definitely there.
So what recommendations are in front of the government that they're preferring not to look at? And would taking on those recommendations counter some of the bigotry that comes from One Nation?
Well, yeah, I guess how do you summarise it? Most people will never have heard of the Multicultural Framework Review, I'm assuming. It appeared momentarily in the public arena. The main result was that there's now a Minister for Multicultural Affairs, but she is, many other things as well. And she would have been in cabinet even if she wasn't the Minister for Multicultural Affairs, small business, development stuff and all the rest of it. Anyway, and she's up against, I think, a group who are really concerned with what they think is social stability. And the more they're pushed to build social mobility, social stability, the less comfortable they are with anything that might change it. And I think they're not sure if they move in this direction, will it bring people towards them and help build greater social understanding, or will it drive people apart and create greater conflict? And I think that's a very real question. that unfortunately or fortunately can only be answered by either doing something or not doing something. Right? And given that not doing something seems to be the easiest position to take, I think that's where we are at the moment.
Let's talk about, let's return to beauty. Let's move away from the ugliness for a moment. Jackie, you worked for many, many years, the Art Gallery in New South Wales, Edmund Capen, when he was there, expanded Asian art. And there were a lot of really positive things that happened in that time and have been happening ever since. What do you think is the power of artists to try and influence the public and bring diversity and bring people together?
Well, artists have obviously have their own creativity, and for that they draw on many sources. And I would just like to bring in community here too, because I mean, one, you can look at the art world and the art community and all their networks, and it's all very tolerant and very stimulating, and they're looking for new things, you know, the whole articulate new ideas. And we've seen that. And artists, but many artists, when you're looking at Asian Australian artists or whatever they might be, their background, they also come from communities. And so to build those community, the networks are not only amongst individual artists, but also amongst the communities from which they come. And of course, one of the things about artists is they are prepared always to experiment and to innovate and to do new things. And this leads us to new ideas. And so maybe it's through the art, like maybe through the artists and their communities, some ideas can grow, which will help deal with this multicultural idea. I mean, I look at some of the show at the moment at the Art Gallery in New South Wales and How I Rise. It's women artists, and women artists from various Asian backgrounds, Aboriginal First Nation backgrounds, diasporas, and they're all coming together, and they are actually in their art articulating new things. I mean, the great thing about so many artists is they bring forward new concepts, new approaches, new emotions. And perhaps this is what we also need in politics in terms of getting through the vision. How do we get where we can see we can go and be strong? And we need these new visions. And I think that's when you look at artists and they draw it together so well and drawing on everything that their own background and coming up with new solutions. And we see this. And last year at the National Art School, there was a show, The Neighbour at the Gate. And that was a lot of artists, First Nation and Asian Australian artists working together. That was their focus on the work they'd created and how they worked together, and this bringing together of different cultural influences. And the work at the very beginning was a second generation Malaysian Chinese artist. So we have there, you're looking at second generation, third generation, and these people, it's where I come back to my first point about, I like to think the mosaic certainly in the art community is very strong.
And of course you do have, as you say, second, third generation, the children of migrants who work between two cultures and can facilitate that understanding. Is there a particular exhibition in the past that tried to do that in an interesting way? You've written about Liu Shaoxiang, The Way We Eat, something like that brings two different concepts together.
Yes. That was a particular work that, yes, the artist, he had a showcase, and in it was all sort of copies of Victorian cutlery, and then there were 40 pieces altogether. This is Liu Shaoxiang, and he came to Australia in 1990 from China, and he went around, and from all the second-hand shops, he was absolutely fascinated by Western cutlery and silverware, and he ended up getting 40 different pieces. I'd never thought about how much different cutlery there was, and this was all the Western cutlery. So in all its flaunting its wealth and flamboyance and that, and against that there was another case alongside it, and in it, pair of chopsticks. That was it. And that's a symbol of China and symbol of less is more, which has gone for centuries against all the indulgence of the Western people and with all their cutlery. It was an absolutely brilliant statement, and it gives a fresh perspective on someone who's come out of the Western tradition. So you see, that's it. And then there's another younger artist, Jason Fu, and he's created this whole story about the only ever Chinese bushranger, Sam Fu. And so he's kind of created, so he's again making us think in terms of the broader society, and how, and rewriting what we have assumed or perceived perhaps as an Anglo-Celt society, rewriting that in terms of other narratives, different narratives, and that's what we need more of, to hear more narratives from people of different backgrounds.
So, Jing, I want to ask you about language. So we talked about art, let's talk about language. And you said earlier that when you first came to Australia as a student and you discovered SBS, the Special Broadcasting Service, and all those beautiful languages. Tell me, what was your impression when you came across this? And now as an academic specialising in languages, what is the beauty of what SBS does in maintaining all those languages?
Long story to start with. Yes, I mentioned I came to Australia in 1988. So one of the most exciting, fascinating discoveries I made was SBS. And I watched the SBS with yellow subtitles. My goodness, who thought of that? And I want to mention this is because it was my first time in my life to watch the Filipino film. And a very interesting, puzzling viewing experience, because I watched the whole film, subtitles superb, as we do, so the best in the world. And I understood each subtitle, but I couldn't get the story. And I was puzzled, how come I just didn't get the story? And then until I watched more of Filipino stories, films, and many other foreign language films, then clicked. Because you need cultural context. You need to have cultural, contextual information. And so for that reason, it's so important to mention that not only SBS is very special around the world, it's one of the very few, because then I traveled to give talks about SBS. Other people in other countries, they will say, wow, you have a national TV supported by the government to do multilingual, multicultural. It's because to understand, like when people get, we talk about one nation or people against the migrants, when you do not know something, when someone who's very different from you and you don't know that person, you intuitively have the fear. So that's what the understanding is so important. Understanding is through culture. And when we talk about one nation or whoever, all those people, they are not just white people. So followers are not just white people, just the people who do not understand each other. And then they have instant, oh, they are different from me. So SBS, the best thing about it, it's multicultural, it's not biculture. It's not just the ethnic, understand the mainstream English culture. I love SBS is because we all learned about each other's culture. And that's why I mentioned this Filipino film, because I never watched it before. So once you know it, and then you understood a lot more. And then talking about that was 1988 when I first came. And almost 40 years later, things were completely different. So I'm optimistic for a very good reason. We have progressed so much. And back then, there were hardly any bits, and then you have to go to Chinatown to buy Chinese grocery. Now you can buy anything, anywhere. You have all types of restaurants or cuisines. And Australia is very different from many other countries, so we are very curious. We are curious about other people, about other cultures. We travel a lot. Australians are everywhere, and the people often say, you know so much. It's because we are multicultural, and then we have this exposure. So And I think Jocelyn mentioned at the opening, is that language is so important. Language opens the door to culture. Without language, we do not understand the culture. And at SBS, one thing people were not realizing is it is actually policy. We are not allowed to dub any programs. We must subtitle programs. All the dubbed version which we buy, we strip off. We subtitle them because we want the audience to hear the original language. And there is linguistic integrity and also audio. And then you realize each language sounds so different, so beautiful. And you do want to be in the language specialist and someone who speaks another language. And if you ask any linguist, what is the most beautiful, fascinating invention of humankind? Language. It's amazing. Each language has its beautiful rhythm, its rules, its patterns. And apparently there are over 7,000 languages. And why do we need so many languages? Why can't we just universally use one language, AI create one language and we all use it? It's because each language covers one aspect of human knowledge or human experiences that other languages do not cover in the same way. We do need all these languages to reflect, to express all these complex, nuanced human emotions, human experiences. So knowing language and knowing about the culture, and I think it's getting, look from where we were and to where we are now. So there is a huge progress.
So what's the danger then in a lot of the universities cutting language programs? Are we sabotaging our beautiful Mosaic?
Absolutely.
By saying, well, we can't afford that anymore, we don't want that anymore, we want the really, you know, CSI, forensics, the really sexy subjects.
Yes, so sort of a quicker cash than they can see. They don't see the essential quality that we carry as a human being. We have this intelligence. We using our intelligence to see through, to understand the world. And language is so important. For people to study other languages and for other language speakers to study English. It is mutual, so we understand a lot more, we get a lot more. And cutting language is really short-sighted, so short-sighted. And I can understand because I teach language-related translation, and decision makers or people who are so short-sighted to say, oh, there are 5 students in this class, so instead of 500. But you may only need 5 in this particular group, and then they are very influential in many ways. And also in the same way, they cut English for migrants, English learning for migrants. Cutting language, it's always a short-sighted. When they realize that the gap, it'll be such a sad thing. It'll take a long time to fill up the gap.
Might be too late.
Absolutely. And anyone who speaks the language or learn the language, it just opened up another world. And your world is much richer, not only for yourself, but for you to understand a lot more about humanities. And, so make the world better is because we understand it better. And yeah, so I just can't speak more about, another world through cultural lenses, through language.
Can I just ask you about a book that you've translated, Melissa Lukashenko's Too Much Lip? She's an Indigenous writer. It's an award-winning book. It tells us a lot about the First Nations culture, the people who were here first. And you've translated it. So tell us about how you translated it. Were there difficulties in trying to get the nuances across? And how does a translation of such a seminal work actually help our Mosaic and also our reputation overseas when people read your book?
Yeah, actually, that's a very good question. Before I answer the question, I also want to mention the progress we have made, because I myself studied literature, English and Australian literature. When I started Australian literature, there was no Indigenous writing. There was no Indigenous writers, so there were few mention about Indigenous people. And now look at the, Maurice Franklin Awards, and we have 5, I think, Indigenous writers winners. And for the last 8 or 5 years, they are all won by writers of color, what we call, Shankri Chenjun and Xiang Lu last year, Chinese background for the first time. So that has progressed a lot. Australian people, readers, general public love reading literature written by multiple cultural backgrounds. And I'm picking on, Jackie just mentioned the younger generation, Jason Fu. They call themselves the third culture kid because they were born and grow up here with some cultural heritage. And then when they become creative, they pull in everything. So, and make it quite uniquely Australian. So that's really, and that makes us so proud as a genuinely multicultural. Talking about Melissa Lukashenko's Too Much Leap, I don't know anyone who here read. It is a beautiful book. It's a wonderful book. I know Melissa so well. And when we're talking about this book, I said to Melissa, it's not easy to understand because she used a lot of Indigenous colloquialism. She said, Jing, you're right. This book is for layers of readers, general readers who read English, and Australian readers who understand Australian history. They get another layer. The top layer are Indigenous people who understand perfectly what I'm talking about. So when I was doing the translation, I realized what she meant. So it's really layers and layers. And that also made me want to translate that book for Chinese readers to understand Indigenous literature in Australia. One reference, just to say, everything is loaded. There is so much loaded information you have to know. And I have to know before I translate it to my readers, to my Chinese readers. One phrase come to my mind is Carrie, who's in the main character, and she's quite rebellious and quite defiant. But at one time, the other people trying to put her down to say, stop, whatever. So and she was saying to herself, yes, if I was smart enough, I know I should backtrack now. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. No, sir. 3 backs full, sir. So, and we know it's nursery of Baba Black Sheep, heavy any wool. So there is English reference there, 13th century wool text means obedience, it's give it to you, give it to you, give it to you. And Indigenous writers picked up that phrase, use it in a subversive, satirical way, not only to satire obedience, but also colonialism and also past governments. So there are layers and layers of meaning of that just kind of children's rhyme. So that's challenges like that, there are loads. And I have to report to say that after the book was published and quite many readers told me, saying that, oh, when I read this book, I feel like Melissa Lukashenko was speaking to me. I said, oh, okay, that's very good. She speaks Mandarin, yes.
Fantastic. So, Andrew, Jing and Jackie have given us some amazing examples of social resilience, the really positive things that actually contribute to this beautiful mosaic. But is the government and state government here too emphasising social cohesion, which social cohesion sounds like a wonderful thing. We all want social cohesion. We all want to be happy together and live happily ever after. But what do we really mean by social cohesion, and how are governments trying to achieve this?
Who is the we that wants to know the answer to that question? Is part of it. When Jackie and Zhang were talking, I was thinking about a little local experiment that's happening in my home municipality of Randwick. where they've just produced a draft cultural diversity plan. It's actually called the Social Cohesion and Multicultural Plan. Because the committee, I wasn't there for the conversations, but the committee was divided over whether they would accede to what the government wants it to be called, which is social cohesion, or whether they would name it what they wanted to call it, which was multicultural. So they ended up with a report, with a policy, which was social cohesion and multicultural. Okay, so, and that points to, I think, exactly the issue that you asked me about. We're in an environment where, as a multicultural society, 10 generations deep as an immigration society, many thousands of generations deep as an indigenous land, we're not yet skilled in knowing how to actually work this all that well. It's not a natural thing to be living amongst strangers, right? To be constantly challenged by new people with new languages. That's actually quite a challenge. And we need to learn, and we used to learn better, how to actually engage with that, right? In the first decades of the post-war migration scheme, most young people were in school environments which were multicultural, right? Since the last time, well, the first big moment in 1996, we now have about 30%, maybe more, of young people who are actually in educational environments which are monocultural. Right? So that's actually what we've been doing is, in a sense, leaching out of the wider culture the capacity to interact with people who are different from ourselves. Right? And that's an issue that we have to deal with. The social, and that's why one of the reasons, and some of you have got our little printout from the ABC Religion and Ethics report. A group of us, about a dozen of us, got together, people from across a range of different backgrounds, different experiences, but all who have been around in the multicultural game, if you like, for at least back to that 1996 moment. And we said, look, we don't think that social cohesion is a very helpful idea anymore, right? Because it implies, or it requires, some idea of a central point around which we cohere. So it's not about flexibility and resilience. It's not about dealing with change. It's about trying to hang on to some sort of simplistic centre point that is unchanging, and everyone has to sign on with that. And one of the examples I like using, in 1996, I was invited to Jakarta to give a talk to the Australian Indonesian Foundation. Right? And the foundation people in Jakarta, tell the speaker what the topic will be. Right, the government had just changed. Pauline Hanson had just been elected for the first time as an independent. And my interlocutor in Jakarta said, we want you to talk about, is Australia a racist nation? Because it was fairly big at the time in the regional press. And I thought, whoa, okay. And remember, this is being funded by DFAT, by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, right? They're picking up the bills. And I wrote a text, which somebody probably quite junior approved. It turned out things got a bit heavier after that. But when at the end of it, I said, well, look, I think the way to describe this is that we're a country with a racist history trying not to have a racist future. Right? So this was a sort of notion of a sort of dynamic, resilient response to what was going on. It was unfortunate that that comment hit the AM radio program the next morning, just as the new foreign minister, Mr. Downer, was meeting with the Indonesian foreign minister in Bali. And it sort of took the wind out of somebody's sails. And I got got my ears slapped very badly for being so naughty. But I think the point about that is that you need to have an idea of a dynamic engagement. One of the problems, and that's one of the reasons I mentioned the emergence of monocultural education as a problem, is that increasingly we live in bubbles, right? And we talk to people like ourselves, and we don't hear other people, and we don't have the skill. We have fewer and fewer skills in how to actually engage with people who are different from ourselves. But at the same time, you know, as Jung and Jackie said, we have this enormously creative emerging new generations who are much more comfortable in operating in these situations, much more comfortable about engaging with people who are different from themselves, who have been, in fact, in the 70% of schools which are still very reasonably multicultural. And I think that's the sort of crisis point that we're at. In 1998, the new government invented the idea of Harmony Day. People may remember Harmony Day and Harmony Week, right? And there was a reason for Harmony Day. It wasn't just sort of pulled out of somebody's back pocket. They did a survey and a big study, and the only concept they could find amongst the Australian population, which at that stage was fairly hyped up because Hanson's campaign had been quite active and there was a lot of stuff going on. It was before the Muslim crisis and still during the Indochinese crisis, the Cambodians and Vietnamese and so on. And they did this study and they discovered that there was quite a high level of intolerance that's one of the contradictions in Australia. 80% of Australians love multiculturalism, but 60% of Australians are prejudiced against people unlike themselves, right? So you've got to work with those two things happening at the same time, right? And the majorities of Australians agree that Australia is a racist country, right? So you've got all of these things happening, and they all sound very different and contradictory, but they're all true at the same time. So you need to try and sort of work out what that actually means. And that takes us back then into the social resilience thing about how do we work with this reality, right? If you think back to the voice, prior to the actual vote, in the early stages of the vote, and this is why the government continued with it, it looked like 60% of the population would support the voice and 40% wouldn't, right? I looked up Farah. Ultimately, Farah voted 75% against the voice, and Coogee voted 75% for the voice. So if you're looking at the balance, that's the story. In the 3 or 4 months that the campaign ran, 20% of Australians went from being mildly accepting of the voice because they didn't think it had anything to do with them to being anxiously opposed, right, as a result of social campaigns and political campaigns. So all of that's real, right? And I think we need to recognise that all of that's real. So the beautiful mosaic and all this stuff that you're talking about is fantastic. I mean, one of the key things in the Randwick Cultural Diversity Plan is an artist exchange deal where artists from the East and artists from the West are being funded to work together around joint projects, which I think is going to be fantastic. But these are still big issues, and it makes me think that local stuff is now increasingly important, that state level and national level stuff is less important, partly because at that level, governments aren't really that interested in investing what is needed in the processes that we need to see. And I think that's where we're at. With that leaflet, we've been asking people who have been supporting it to get onto their local member of parliament, get onto their favourite senator, whatever your party is, it doesn't matter. Maybe One Nation might be a problem, but you know, whatever your party is, and convince them to try and change the conversation, right? To say, we can do this, we need to do it, we need to be into a nation building mode which recognises all the things that we've been talking about as really, really important parts of the story, right? While we recognise that lots of these structures are actually trying to close down lots of those stories.
Well, 40% of the primary vote in Farrer was for One Nation. Now, I know that there's a completely different demographic there. It's not,
Well, yep.
it's not Australia. It's not Australia, but there has been so much that Australians have had to deal with. You know, the Hamas atrocity, Gaza, the Bondi massacre, the return of the ISIS brides. People have gone nuts over this. And there is a very low appetite for that empathy. I know you write that there is empathy in Australia, but it's been ideologically captured. So how do we stop what Paul Keating calls Pauline Hanson's, dumb bigotry from taking over?
But being an academic and a social scientist, I say the first thing we need to know is actually what is going on, right? We need research rather than prejudice. And today, I don't know if any of you are great followers of the daily feed from the Royal Commission of Anti-Semitism, Social Cohesion, but today Andrew Marcus, who is a historian and social scientist from Melbourne and has been the lead researcher for nearly 20 years on the Scanlon Foundation Social Cohesion research that appears every year. He was giving evidence based on new research that he's been carrying out around exactly this issue to do with anti-Semitism, et cetera, And he said, look, okay, anti-Semitism is a very confusing term. People jump all over the place. Let's actually break it down into the two main things that we're really talking about, right? On the one hand, we're talking about Jew hate. You know, we hate Jews. And on the other hand, we're talking about anti-Zionism. We hate Israel or we hate Zionism. Okay. So let's separate them out. And we're going to interview a great range of people across Australia. And we're going to ask them what their attitudes are to these questions. And the results, and then we're going to ask them how they vote, where they live, how they vote, how old they are, what gender they are. And so they've come back, he came back and he was saying today that there's four main blocks in Australian society, right? And it happens to be about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in this particular study, but it's insightful generally into the makeup of the Australian population, right? So at one end, you have older people who live outside the major cities, in rural areas, who are not tertiary educated, right? And they're the ones who tend to vote, or they did up till last weekend, the ones who mainly voted for One Nation, right? And they're quite curious. They don't like Jews, but they like Israel, right? So they support Israel, don't like Jews. Okay, so that's one end of the story, okay? Hang on to that one. Okay, the other end of the story, you have young women, tertiary educated, living in the cities, right? They hate Israel, but they love Jews. Okay, right? And they vote Green. Okay, so you've got Greens here, One Nation there. Okay, and they're the polar opposites, right? And then there are two other groups, right, which are a mix of attitudes, right? And they spread through the Labor voters, Liberal voters, whatever, right? What tends to be the case is the better educated you are and the more urban you are, the more likely it is that you have low tolerance of Jew hate. You're not into Jew hatred, but you're very suspicious of Israel and what it's doing, right? So anti-Zionist, but it spreads, right? It's a mix all the way across. And then there's one group that doesn't like Jews and doesn't like Israel, right? And they tend to be young men, right? And if you look at who's just been dragged into the One Nation camp, right, that's that group, right? So they might be voting, they might have voted Liberal, or actually they might have been right-wing liberals at one point. They might be part of the MAGA movement. They might be part of the whole young male sort of anti-feminist movement, all those sorts of people. So that gives you quite a complex picture of Australia, right? It doesn't, you know, and you can get a sense of where the sorts of people who really love the stuff that we've been talking about are going to sit in that picture, right? Though the Israel Australia thing is has really knocked around a lot of that stuff around. But that is the complexity of the society. So if you're trying to make a public policy to, you know, for instance, right, we were talking about this before, you want a public policy that actually removes the idiocy of the policy of charging $50,000 for an arts degree, you know, the intent of which is to destroy the arts, humanities, cultural studies, language, and literature in Australia, and it's doing it very effectively. Then you've got to think, you know, if I'm in charge of that policy, who's going to like this if I do something about it? Not my voters, right? Somebody else. Do I want to give somebody else a fillip? No, I'm going to stick with, you know, the group that's voting for me in this with the current national government. At the state level, I think it's much more complicated because the intensity of ethnic diversity in state seats is, because they're smaller, it's much more complicated as you move across the place. But at the moment, the social cohesion debate is very much focused on either you support social cohesion because it's about stopping people shooting each other, which is a very good idea, or you oppose social cohesion because it stops you protesting about things that you think you should be allowed to protest about. Right? And there's not much conversation across that divide.
You mentioned the degrees, which I think is very important, $50,000 degrees. I didn't pay for my education back in the day, thank you, Gough Whitlam. But you know, my kids got $25,000 art degrees. Now they're looking at $50,000. And what we talked about, the young people, the resilient young people, and the wonderful authors and the wonderful artists. How many people from out in Western Sydney or lower socioeconomic electorates, maybe even Jason Clare's, dare I say, would want to embark on a $50,000 degree to become a writer or a translator or an artist? What do you feel about that? This is your perspective, students and artists. Why would they want to spend all that money and be in debt for the rest of their lives?
And no one wants to spend, because my daughter just did a humanities degree, and she spent 5 years, and I think it's $80,000 in debt. So I don't think she will never be able to pay it back without our help. This $50,000 degree has been opposed by all universities, by all vice chancellors. They're hoping they're quite strong voice, including our Vice Chancellor, Professor George Williams, voiced strongly against this job-ready package. So hopefully they will see the census, and because originally thinking they would increase, economically doesn't work because they increase this arts degree and then lowering the other STEMs. But the problem is the STEM lowered so much, so you have to have a huge numbers to make up with the money you teach. So it actually doesn't work out even for numbers. But talking about the education, not only formal education, but really just education as educating people's mind is just so important. And I mentioned when I first came, I was at SBS, working at SBS. My son went to high school, and then his friend asked, you know, what does your mom do? Oh, my mom works at SBS. Li Lingqing is your mom? My son said, yep. So this will not happen anymore, because in those days there were very few, like, you know, so Education has become so much so, and it is really, it's not novelty anymore in that sense. And also children, anyone who have children, you know, when they grow up together with their mates, friends, they all mixed looking. They are oblivious to whatever the color, the background you're from. So that's what I'm saying that younger generation, when they grow up, they are much more sophisticated. They sing a lot more. They're less prejudiced than our older generation, and they are more acceptable. The other thing I want to mention is multiculturalism is really about understand diversity, accept diversity, and celebrate diversity. And currently, Jackie mentioned art. We do art as well. We have a little art gallery. And currently, I curated an exhibition called Fish. Why is it called Fish? This is an Australian Chinese artist. And he was inspired by carps in Australia, that so much so that they choked up Australian river system. And that was very surprising because in China, carps were highly prized. They are lovely fish that everyone wants to eat. And also fish in Chinese tradition, it's symbolize abundance. It's homophone of abundance. So, and also symbolize success, symbolize freedom, symbolize spirituality. So a lot of positive things. So he was very surprised to hear that story. And then he created multitudes of fish with silicon and electronic mechanism in it, so they move. They are so real, multitudes. So I used his fish, multitudes, and then the first look is, wow, they're so real. Every student's staff, when they pass by, they could not resist not coming. And then my point is, and then you have a closer look. They are exactly the same. So the appearance makes like they are lively, but it's really the same, pleasant sameness. And then after they come watching through, and then I say, ask your question. Do you want to be a fish? Everyone says no. So no one wants to be the same. So I want to use the other way to say diversity is actually so beautiful, so important for each of us to exist. We are individual. We are different from the next one. You are different from your children. Siblings are different. No one is the same. But based on that, we accept, celebrate individuality. So anyone who is different from us is a good thing.
Jackie, I just want to bring you in here because we're talking about art and the ability to change, and it's great when you have an exhibition that's fun and it's about chopsticks and cutlery and whatever and bushrangers. But what about when you have a really confronting exhibition like Khaled Sabsabi's years ago? He had a visual rendition of the head of Hezbollah, you know, Nasrallah, who's dead now. Yes. And he was about to be selected for the Biennale, Australia's Venice Biennale, and he was cancelled because that was discovered in his back catalogue. So what do you think about the fact that so many artists are now being cancelled because we don't like that art? We like that art, that's safe, but that's a little bit too confronting. That's made us think about things. So artists do good work until they do something that is a little bit too sensitive.
Yeah, for me, yes, I can't talk about that particular.
Yeah, but you can talk about artists in general getting cancelled.
Yes, well, artists have often had taken political stance, and that's produced some very great graphic imagery too. And you can see this too in Asian collections, and you can see it in public collections in Australia, where they're being given Chinese posters and Chinese woodcuts, for example. So that's very good. And the thing is too, this once you get into another culture, I mean, if you look at China, there's such a sophisticated way of artists making political comments which aren't obvious and upfront. So and they've had to do that because of the political environment in which they are, in which they live. So yes, I'd just like to go back to say what Jing Han was saying about young people too, because it's quite distinctive that young people relax, are much cross-cultural, multicultural. They're much more relaxed. And I see this when I've had young interns too, that's what they respond to. You know, they just talk amongst themselves. It's not an item to be a different culture or different ethnicity or whatever. And then you can see when looking at Australia how we embrace so much. I mean, now apparently Lunar New Year is the largest celebration is in Sydney in the Southern Hemisphere. You know, we've embraced all that. And the other night I was looking at gardening in Australia and it all had a whole Asian component. So, I mean, sorry, I moved from the political thing to say more that community thing about how widespread, in fact, the appreciation of Asian cultures is in that general way.
Perhaps I can put it this way. Someone listening to this podcast in Picton would say, that's great, but I've never been to the Art Gallery of New South Wales. I don't really get to the art gallery and gee, that's very elitist and they're all sitting in the Dr. Chau Chak Wing, beautiful museum, but I've never been there. Should we take the art further out there? Are we doing it?
We used to take the art out there. There used to be travelling art shows, and again, that's been cut back. And I will say you are right about the art gallery and where it is. When we did it, I did one big Asian show, and we had to produce maps of where Wynyard was and how to get to Wynyard when we went out to bring in the communities. And the other thing we had to do was produce multilingual brochures and posters. So, yeah, institutions, you know, it's a challenge to actually acknowledge and bring in all the different communities.
Well, at this stage, let's bring in the audience. Let's have some questions from the audience. Yep.
I formerly taught at this university. And when I came here, I discovered that compulsory languages for entrance into honours year had been abandoned by the university before Dawkins reforms, in fact. This is a very long-standing hostility to external languages being made compulsory for the intellectual elite of this country. And one tends to feel the reason why Madame Hansen can be so mind-bogglingly ignorant is because our elite, the ones who paid to go to university, and our other members of our society at that level are also mind-bogglingly ignorant. And if you look at the stuff that they're reading every day in the Australian, I confess I've not read it for more than 10 years, but I looked at it the other day and it's still the same. If you look at what they think is informed comment about any range of issues, let alone those to do with immigration, you will find that they are on a level which you would describe as trivial and intellectually risible. And I think these two phenomena are linked. I think this society decided in the 1950s, the elite of the society, the educated part of the society, decided in the 1950s to be ignorant about the world and to follow the Anglo route. And I would like to know how we can get out of it. Because if you talk to a student who has a foreign language, you will find that they're systematically underprivileged because they know a language from their family. We talk about background languages, but they know background languages. They're not allowed to use that as a way of privileging themselves or making themselves prominent in our society.
So your question is maybe to Andrew?
Well, I think Andrew's had a good go, and I'm very educated by Andrew. I'd like to put it to you, Helen, because I've seen you on TV. And I'd like to know what you think about absolute ignorance of foreign culture and language, which is part of public culture in Australia.
Wow. I wasn't expecting a question, but you said the 1950s we decided. Well, I arrived in Australia in 1965 and I was 5 years old, and so English is my second language. I didn't really find what you think is we decided to become ignorant. I went to a working class school where all the kids could pronounce my name. I can remember some very difficult Polish names. Jenny Balajewicz, who was one of my good friends, and I can say that it rolls off the tongue in all those other languages. And I didn't feel any different until I went to high school, and a boy who I'm told, don't mention his name, is probably, said to me one day, "Ha, my dad told me you're a wog." And my whole world came crashing down because I didn't know I was different. And suddenly I was different. But my dad told me, so kids grow up innocent and they go to university, and back then it was free. Now I really despair at $50,000 degrees. I don't think we as a nation decided, but you know, Andrew is the best analyst who pinpoints the times, you know, those sort of points where we change, and it was the politicians, and we are at a moment now where we do have a government with a huge majority. Do something with it. Jason Clare has got his electorate's working class out in Western Sydney. You know, let's change this. Let's do something. I don't know whether that's answered your question, but I like to think that we are inherently good, but I'm sure there's a lot of dads saying to their kids now, because I grew up in South Australia and I've just come back from Adelaide. The South Australian election saw the rise of One Nation as well. And in the suburb, the working class suburb that I grew up in, a very good friend of mine who I've known since I was 5, had a Facebook post about the ISIS brides, and she was livid that they were allowed back in, and all the comments after that in the Facebook feed were, Pauline Hanson, I'm voting One Nation, One Nation, One Nation. And I'm just horrified. I'm horrified. Port Adelaide, where I grew up. So I hope that answers your question. Another question here.
Hi, this is for Andrew. You said that schools are sort of segregating into they're segregating the schools. Like you said, they're sort of like moving to monocultures. How is that happening? Like, isn't it the schools based in areas, and is it because people are?
There is a certain irony about it. In that wonderful year, 1996, with the arrival of the Howard government, they were ideologically committed to privatising education and giving parental choice. They were primarily driven by some of the new Protestant schools that were turning up. But one of the consequences was that everybody who wanted to have their own ethno-nationalist, ethno-religious school could do so in that funding model. And so what we got very rapidly was across the middle class, right? So the more affluent segments of every ethnic community, these schools emerged, right? Now, technically they teach a national curriculum, that's not the issue. But for the most part, the makeup of those schools tends to be fairly monocultural, right? And while they are usually, I don't know, quite required, while they do basically recognise the need for their students to interact with different students from different backgrounds so that they're not cut off, it's a very different situation to Port Adelaide in the 1960s, right, or 1970s, where you had a sort of, if you can call the word melting pot of different cultures and languages and so on. And that was as true of the diocesan Catholic schools as it was of the state system, right? the diocesan schools were full of Catholics from all over the world, Maltese, Italians, whatever. And I think that's one of the consequences of that decision was that we are less and less capable at a sort of deep cultural level, particularly because it's the middle class kids, right? These are the ones who are likely to go on to university, et cetera, And I was talking, in fact, to a senior government minister a couple of weeks ago about this, because Julian Hill, who is the Assistant Minister for Multiculturalism, he had a formal speech about that time, and he referred to the Singapore model, which requires interaction between the three major racial groups in Singapore because they've had race riots, they know what that means. And I was referring to that, and she said, yeah, my sister's daughter went to a monocultural denominational school, right? And she was very successful. And then she went to university and completely fell apart because she had no way of dealing with what she encountered, which was people different from herself, right? Now, that's a particular example, and there are many counterexamples like the ones that we've been talking about, but that's part of the dynamic. And if you actually then lay on top of that the effects of social media and the creation of social media bubbles, then you've got quite a challenging situation. But it's not that none of that is on the government policy environment. It's too difficult in too many different ways.
Okay.
Thank you. Great discussion. Question to the panel, mainly Andrew. So when I was growing up, multiculturalism was a very positive thing. Now it kind of seems like this idea of moral and cultural relativism is closely associated with the objection to multiculturalism. Do you think that is true? Do you think that an objection to cultural relativism is intolerance? And do you think religion's got something to do with it?
That's an interesting question. I'll try and be quick. If you compare the state and federal governments in this context, right, which I think is really important, every state government has something like a multicultural commission or whatever, right? Every state government which has the where the rubber hits the road responsibilities has some sort of policy about trying to advance intercultural collaboration in some way or another. But at the national level, there's nothing. Right? And I think that's a critical problem. The Multicultural Framework Review said we desperately need a nation-building multicultural strategy with right institutions that can actually carry this forward and find the resources. Your question about language, nobody gives a toss about language anymore at the national level. Right? There was a period when the gentleman behind you was growing up where the national government had a very strong commitment to bilingualism and supporting the teaching of languages. And in my day, as I think probably yours, everyone at middle class schools did at least one language in addition to English, right? And in my school, it was usually two languages, right? So everybody, not that they could speak them fluently. I mean, my fluency in Latin is very, very limited, but that part of history has in fact gone, and I think what we're seeing, and your point about this sort of re-emergent nativism, is I think a very good one. That there are many dynamics that are pushing that forward, and there's not much resistance to it. Right? So nativism, I mean, people presumably have come across the sort of manosphere conversations that have been going on, right? So if you look at the people who are driving the nativism stuff, they're embedded in the culture of the manosphere. Right? So it's a gender thing, it's a nationalist thing, it's all sorts of things associated with that culture, which is fed very heavily in the sort of commercial media environments. But anyway, I mean, that's one we could talk about all night. And you'd probably do it down at the pub over a beer, mate.
We've spoken a lot tonight about the government's lack of ambition or lack of a vision thereof. I'm a second generation immigrant from the western suburbs of Sydney, and might I add, I do have a very heavy HECS debt over my head. We saw at the election on Saturday in Farrer, Barnaby Joyce said, "Western suburbs of Sydney, we're coming for you," afterwards. Thought that was very scary. Is the issue really neglect from the Albanese government, the most multicultural and diverse caucus in Australia's history? Or is it a neglect of, or lack of, bipartisanship on multiculturalism across parties? And I guess my question for you is, what is visionary? What is, if you each had to, implement a policy change or a suggestion to the government, what would that be?
No, you can answer it. That's the question. Did you hear the question?
No, sorry, I didn't
No,
hear
no, no,
I'm
maybe-
sorry, I didn't hear
yeah.
the question. Sorry.
What is visionary? I think that this is probably what is visionary to enhance multiculturalism on a federal or state level, federal maybe. Yeah. What would be visionary?
What would the vision be, or the vision? What would be visionary?
Policy. Maybe Andrew, do you want to answer that? No.
I can't say
Him.
about policy. I'm not a policy person, but I can see your point. And I teach at Western Sydney University. Western Sydney University is so diverse, so multilingual, multicultural groups. For all the events that we do, we attract different community groups. That give me a very strong idea or vision or goal is to interconnect. For example, if we feature a writer, Shankri Chandran from Sri Lanka, all the Sri Lankan related community, they all appear. And then we feature a Middle East writer and all the Middle East, group appear. And then we feature a Chinese artist, but then they are not interconnected. And I think that weakens us as a multicultural community. So we sort of only speak among ourselves, not to each other. And I feel if we all connected together, and that is genuinely multicultural, and that should be make this society much stronger, make us much stronger. And to do that, we need to be open-minded. For example, I'm in the Chinese community. In the community, people tend to say, we are the center, we should only focus on our own. I think we should look at your neighbor next door, so what they are doing, what's their culture. So I think intercultural connection, intercultural connectedness is vital for the success of multiculturalism in Australia.
I think we have to leave it now, don't we? One more question. Okay.
Well, so a little bit of my background now, the questions. I was born in Ukraine. I was raised in the US. My mother is here, she's been here for 2 years, and the past 7 years I spent in China. And of course, I traveled a lot for work before, for India, East Asia, for like Emirates, right? What I've noticed that every single country is racist in one way or the other. And do you think it's actually possible to get rid of racism? Because I believe from one country to the other, the level of racism is different and the seriousness of racism. For example, when I lived in China and I was trying to work with the government, they wouldn't let me do that just because I'm white, right? I'm a foreigner, right? So I'm not allowed to be there, which is not very bad because I got a lot of privileges there and they were very friendly to me. But the only
It's still foreigner.
And I wasn't welcome to certain circles because I'm from a different culture. When I was in the US, everybody was fighting racism fiercely, but then every single person had their own preferences and deep in their hearts they're all racist. That's what we thought, right? Different races, which like different nationalities respect most of their own nation. And then what I noticed in Europe, what happens is that they're trying to fight racism, they're trying to be multicultural, but then a lot of people from other countries take advantage of it. They move to Europe and they start doing some crazy things there, and the government is trying to be loyal to them in order to win some votes. So my point is, do we really have to fight the racism, or should we more focus on educating kids in the kindergarten? Because I think we're a lost case already. So like we have our preferences, we have our views. Do you think we should start teaching kids that everybody is equal, but how do we do it? Because yet in every country, one's nation will be pushing their own narratives rather than supporting the culture of somebody else or of your neighbor, as you have mentioned before.
If I can jump in, I fully agree with you. And also, different country, different nation, they have different types of racism. I know that because I translated the whole 7 years of the Chinese dating show, If You're the One, 500 episodes. And one of the words I translated often, and I keep it, is a foreigner. You are foreigner. If you're not Chinese, you're a foreigner. We don't care. We don't care. You are Italian, you are Greek, you are Irish. If you're not Chinese, you're a foreigner. So when I pointed out, I said, you know, like all the years that I've been doing the translation, studying language, foreigner is not, it's not a nice word. I don't want to be called foreigner. And then my Chinese colleagues or friends say, but we call them in a very friendly way. We sometimes call them outweigh. It's a kind of, you know, intimate, but you differentiate. He's not one of us. So that's also racism. When I pointed out, they can see that. And I also pointed out to the producer of that show, they reducing the using of a foreigner. So I think education is a key. And it's not to ignore, because yes, you are aware of it because you are well-traveled and you lived in many countries. That's very important. So you get understanding. And so I think you talk about educate children. Educate children is so important. My children, when they grow up, they very young, they started, that's a stereotype. You can't see that. I can see they're more racial awareness than I was. So, and children, once you have the awareness, and then you can tackle that racism. Racism in all forms and shapes, against the color, I think it's primarily something different from you. And this is what we need to tackle, something different from you, not necessarily not as good as you, or, you know, has not the same value. And I think it's important to see Australia is actually very good in many ways, and you have traveled in many places. If we talk about less racism, or we are more multicultural, at least we are more openly talking about racism than many other countries. Other countries, either they are not even aware, no, we are not racist at all. What is racism? Or they shut up, they cannot talk. So in Australia, you can openly talk about it. That's a very good thing. So I think I mentioned the top 10 largest groups of migrants, and eventually there will be representation. And I asked Helen, I said, you know, the representation is so important, representation of the physical population represented on all levels, especially leadership. If you look at the leadership, doesn't represent at all the top 10 largest groups. And on any senior leadership, companies, universities, governments, local governments, anywhere you can see, it's not. So once that would also be one way of achieving less racism, is just because we understand more, we accept. Children accept because they don't differentiate. They are colorblind in many ways until their parents told them, you know, call that person whatever. Well, really, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Jing, and thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Jackie. And yes, thank you. Thank you, Ian.
Yes.
It's a real delight to me as President of the Australian Institute of International Affairs here in New South Wales to thank the organisers here at the incredibly handsome Chau Chak Wing Museum for organising such an interesting evening, and most particularly to thank our speakers. I'm going to count all four of you as speakers, since chairing a discussion like this is probably one of the hardest parts of it. You've all presented us with some fascinating insights into this question, some of them linguistic. One of our questioners said a moment ago that he's a second generation Australian, and I was thinking to myself, well, so am I. But somehow when all four grandparents are from various disadvantaged parts of Britain, it doesn't have quite the same resonance. Multiculturalism. It came into usage exactly as Andrew was explaining to us when we wanted to get away from the term assimilation, which was held not to be the right attitude to people coming to join our society. And the point of multiculturalism is for this to be something of a two-way process. The extent to which that's been the case has obviously been affected by the realism of the fact that if you want to live successfully in a particular country, you become part of its culture in terms of things like language. Some of the most substantial groups of immigrants when I was a child, 70 years ago, were our Greek community. And I think, Helen may correct me on this, but I think I can truthfully say that throughout my entire life, I've never met a single Australian, other than one of Greek origin, who spoke Greek. Can you think of any?
Sorry, a single.
Australians,
Yeah.
who are not of Greek origin.
Yes. Who could speak?
Not many. One.
Dr. Alfred Vincent, who taught at the Modern Greek Studies here. He speaks fluent Greek.
Taught Greek studies.
Yeah.
I think you see my point.
Yeah.
Australians don't learn a lot of languages, as has been pointed out. There's a smattering of French, which is still the most widely taught foreign language in our country, absurd as that may be. There's a certain amount of Italian. I think in both cases, French and Italian, it's often more to do with matters of cuisine than anything more substantial. A certain elite in the case of Italian are perhaps doing it for reasons of opera. But, you know, we're not a very multilingual society. Multicultural, okay. I think the terminology now has become one about migration. The debate was about assimilation. Now the debate is about migration. And who would have guessed that the public mood, as reflected in Farah, would have moved to the extent it has? Who would have expected Anthony Albanese to make such astonishingly unfriendly remarks about the returning so-called ISIS brides, refugee women and their children, with every right to come back to Australia, treated, I think, at least at the level of rhetoric, abominably, though, thankfully, they're back here. So I'm not going to take time as the evening's over to thank every individual speaker, but I was very grateful for Andrew's shafts of light on this whole issue cast by the current anti-Semitism inquiry. An interesting crossover there. And I thought that Jackie's comments on the relevance of art came as a refreshing additional insight. So look, that's enough from me. It's time to go home. But my warmest thanks to our speakers and to all of you, including a good contingent from the Institute of International Affairs, for coming along this evening.
It simply remains for me to add my vote of thanks to Ian and to the panel, and would ask the panel to stay behind for a few minutes because we want to take a group photo. Thank you.